when you're born, you're dealt this genetic hand of what your DNA is going to be like. And for the most part, you're pretty much stuck with that. But what seems to be special about the microbiota is its ability to change. It's plastic and malleable. And the fact that those changes can be a result of decisions that we make, like what we feed it, whether or not we're taking antibiotics, whether or not, we've been exposed to animals. And so I think that's a really powerful message for people, that there's some really, 99% of your genetic material that you're carrying around, you have some control over. And so I think, that's great news for a lot of us. And I think just that message is pretty powerful, that we can do something to kind of maybe mitigate a bad genetic hand we were dealt at birth or something.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to build on that, the one final thing that I would say before the final questions is, we know that there's tremendous complexity in the gut microbiota. You're talking about hundreds of microbial species and then interacting with your human body, which is incredibly complex just on its own. And so it will take decades for us to unravel all of the mechanistic connections and how to optimize these. But I would say that we shouldn't be discouraged that we have to wait for decades to do something about maximizing the positive impact our microbiota can have on our health. Just because the system is complex doesn't mean that the solution to having a healthy microbiota needs to be complex.
Hey everyone, it's Mike Mutzel here with HighIntensityHealth.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're live here with Justin and Erica Sonnenburg. They are Stanford scientists and the authors of this new great book, The Good Gut. Hopefully you can see that and it's not too turned around for you, but I've been diving through this book the last couple of days. I got it over the weekend and it's one of the best books out right now on the gut and how you can manipulate your own gut bacteria and to improve your health. So Dr. Erica and Justin, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you.
Great to be here.
So let's kind of talk about why you wrote the book. I mean, maybe you can start out with kind of this new age understanding of our gut bacteria and how we're kind of shifting away from bacteria are bad to, oh my gosh, there's 100 trillion of these guys and they do a lot of good for our body.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been known for over a century now that we have these dense community of microbes residing in our distal gut. And I think, just over the past decade, really, there's just been this awakening as to the importance of this microbiota for human health. And this has been driven a lot by sequencing technology. The same technologies that helped us decipher the human genome have been turned towards our gut microbes and really given us unprecedented resolution for the microbes and the genes that are present there. And, we know that there are 100 trillion microbial cells in our distal gut. There are 10 times more cells there than human cells in our human body. And if we look at gene content, there's actually 100 times more genes in this composite genome, the microbiome, compared to our human genome. So of all the genetic material we carry around, only 1% of it is human and 99% of it is microbial. And those numbers seem fantastic. And the question is, how much does this really mean for human health? And what we're finding in all the scientific studies that are going on right now is that these microbes really connect in major ways to human biology, digestive health for sure, but also they connect to our metabolism, our systemic immune function, to our central nervous system. So when you consider those three huge aspects, there's really no part of our biology that goes untouched by these microbes in some direct or indirect way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk about that in your book, that we're really a sum of our microbes, not the other way around. I guess what I would like to kind of tease out from kind of some of the topics in your book is that what are ways that we can really intervene? Because we know there's many ways that we don't have control over our birthing method, whether or not we were breastfed, whether or not we've been given antibiotics. Like, what are some of the tips that you recommend for people to really ramp up their microbiome and improve the diversity?
Well, this gets back to your first question about why we wrote the book. I think part of it was, after having our kids and being around other families, we saw that we were making choices and doing things different than what we saw a lot of other families doing. And these were, highly educated families. And we realized at that point that we had, working in the field of microbiota research, we had information that wasn't really out in the public yet, and that was influencing the way that we were raising our kids and the decisions that we were making.
Mm-hmm.
One of the major things was diet and, what we were feeding ourselves and our children. And what we found from, research in the field and in our lab was that these microbes in our gut really rely on complex carbohydrates. That's one of the major functions that they're performing in the gut for us. They're digesting these resistant complex polysaccharides that come from plant material, so fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and they digest them for us. And while they're doing that, they're releasing compounds into our gut that get soaked into our bloodstream that are doing a huge number of things, helping us maintain an immune system balance, helping us decide whether or not we're storing calories or burning them. So we really focused our diet based on this information on making sure that we were feeding these microbes. And that means basically a high dietary fiber diet. So we were just making sure that every time that we sat down for a meal, that there was food on our plate that was feeding our microbes, be it beans or vegetables, fruits, whole grains, that type of thing.
And this gets back to something that you alluded to, which I think is very important to expand on, which is this desire to increase diversity in the microbiota. And it's a somewhat debated subject right now, just how important diversity is in the gut microbiota. But there's, I think, a lot of strong evidence that has recently come out that's very consistent with more diversity being better to a certain extent, and that Westerners and people living in the modern industrialized world having a compromised diversity of the gut microbiota. And so I think a large part of our book is dedicated to this idea of, how would you foster a diverse ecosystem and what can this mean for human health?
Mm. Yeah, and I love the analogy that you illustrate. I think it was in chapter 1 or 2 in your book where you talk about jelly beans and talked about diversity. So for folks that aren't familiar with bacterial diversity, tell that jelly bean analogy and kind of paint the picture so people can understand what's going on there.
Yeah, sure. That was Erica's idea. So
yeah, so we have a huge amount of microbes in our gut, but one of the things is, it's not just one type of bacteria. There are several hundred to even up to 1,000 different species of bacteria that live in there. And so if you compare the microbiota of, say, the average Westerner, that number, if you think of each microbe species as a type of jelly bean, like a color or flavor, then the Western microbiota looks more like a jar of, a simple mix of jelly beans, just a handful of flavors and colors. But if you look at modern day hunter-gatherers or modern day people that live a lifestyle similar to how basically all humans lived at the beginning of agriculture, their microbiota contains a way more diverse collection of jelly beans and flavors and colors. So they have species of bacteria that we just don't see in the Western world. And so the question is, what does that mean for our health in the Western world, that we're not only missing these species, but we just have much less of them in general? And if you just think of ecosystems in general, most ecosystems, when they're losing diversity, most ecologists would say, well, that's not a good thing. And so the question is, this ecology that we're losing in our gut in the Western world, is that something that's impacting our health in a negative way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk about how maybe that skewed research a little bit because, a lot of the research on the gut microbiome has been in, Americans and Europeans. But if you just said that the diversity is so much different compared to indigenous people that, are living, off the grid, so to speak. So kind of talk about that a little bit. Like, do we have a skewed perspective on what a healthy gut microbiome really is?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I think it's correcting over time as we get more information about different populations around the world. But there was this phenomenal program that was started at the National Institutes of Health called the Human Microbiome Project. It ran for about 5 years and set out with this really great goal of defining what a healthy microbiota is, and then also some related projects in looking at how the microbiota changes in different disease states. So this project was a phenomenal success. It gave us a huge amount of information, sequencing large quantities of bacteria from different people, mostly in the United States, and has served as really a platform of information for continuing and launching new phases of discovery. But one of the, I think, shortcomings of that program was that the healthy microbiota that was used as the prototype was that of a healthy Westerner, a healthy American. And I think what we're coming to realize as we gain more information about the microbiota is that just because someone is healthy doesn't mean that they have a healthy microbiota. And there's actually a lot of evidence pointing towards most of us in the United States having a microbiota that actually is unhealthy and is predisposing us to many Western diseases, all these modern plagues. If you've read anything about the hygiene hypothesis or looked at any of these curves of prevalence of these Western diseases, the trends are just alarmingly upward over the past several decades, and they continue to rise. And this is for tens of diseases: heart disease, metabolic syndrome, autoimmune diseases, cancers. They're all going up in synchrony. And it's possible that there's a different cause for each one, that you have 30, 40 different causes for 30 or 40 different diseases. But it's also possible, and I think likely, that there are 1, 2, or 3 major factors that explain a huge amount of this rise in diseases. And I think a lot of arrows are pointing in the direction of the microbiota being really central to us in the modern world being predisposed to these diseases. And then getting back to these traditional societies, if you look at the people populations that live more similar to how our ancient ancestors lived, whether it's at the dawn of agriculture or even further back to when we were hunter-gatherers. And really, humans as a species, out of our 200,000 years of existence, we spent 190,000 of those years, that is 95% of the time, as hunter-gatherers predominantly. And so it's worth examining that lifestyle, the few populations that remain that live like that, to try to understand what the microbiota may have looked like that we actually co-evolved with. Mm-hmm. And so studies are starting to come out. We're doing some of those studies in our lab that are unpublished right now. And it's, all of these different studies and all these different populations are telling us a very similar message, which is that the Western microbiota has way less diversity, that all these populations have way more flavors of jelly beans and also consume way more fiber, don't have antibiotics as readily accessed as we do, and a lot of other lifestyle factors that are different.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about it in your book. I want to talk about pregnancy and diversity, but first go back to kind of this Big Mac diet, which I love how you think people are going to really remember that one. But and you talk about these indigenous cultures, and they're eating a lot of tubers. So the so-called Big Mac diet, which I love for you to define, and the tubers. So what in our 21st century diet, what sort of tubers should we really be focusing on a daily basis? Like parsnips, butternut squash. Like, what are your favorites?
So just to define what MACs are, and for your audience, if they don't know, so that's a term that we actually came up with that means, it stands for Microbiota Accessible Carbohydrates. So these are carbohydrates that you consume that can feed our microbiota. And the reason why we came up with that term is because there wasn't really a good word to explain what the microbiota was eating. I mean, people use complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides, but these are ill-defined terms. So we decided if we came up with this term MAC, then everybody would know what we were talking about. But basically, a proxy for MACs is dietary fiber. And so if you think about like a high MAC diet, that would just be a diet that has a lot of dietary fiber, because that's what's written on. That's what you can look for. That's what's written on the label. Mm-hmm. So this idea of like what hunter-gatherers eat relative to us. One major difference is that, yes, they eat a lot of tubers, but their tubers are not a product of agriculture. So these are wild tubers that have not been bred for maybe increased sweetness, maybe a little bit less fiber, because wild tubers are pretty difficult to chew. And so we've bred a lot of characteristics out of these plants to make them more palatable for humans. So I think it's tough to compare directly what they're eating and what we're eating, because even though they eat tubers, we eat tubers, nutritionally, they may be very different. And so what we've tried to do, since we don't have access to the wild tubers that these hunter-gatherers are eating, we try to eat a diverse collection of plants. So the idea is that if we bred out a lot of dietary fiber out of, say, our parsnips or butternut squash, if we eat a bunch of different types of tubers, along with berries, along with leafy greens, then hopefully we can recreate the diversity of dietary fiber that our ancestors ate.
Love that. Really well said right there. And maybe we can kind of expand upon that and not just talk about tubers, but maybe polyphenolic compounds and how those affect the growth of bacteria. Any thoughts or feedback there?
Yeah, well, that's one of the really, I think, challenging areas that this field has to confront, which is parsing out the benefits of dietary fiber from other plant natural compounds that could be incredibly beneficial. And so I think on the one hand, we can make a general statement that's fairly safe, which is Americans and Westerners in general should just eat more plants that have complex fibers in them, not potatoes, not white rice, not refined flour, but foods that have a lot of dietary fiber, a lot of roughage, and there are likely to be a lot of other beneficial things that come along for the ride in addition to nourishing your microbiota. It brings up this very good question of, if you don't have access to a lot of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, but you can buy purified fiber. Maybe you don't have enough time to cook, or you just want to add Metamucil to your glass of drinking water in the morning and just try to take care of the fiber. We really don't have a lot of evidence, a lot of good studies to tell us whether a single type of fiber and just a lot of it will be good for your health as a diverse variety of fiber from purified sources, and then a diverse fiber from whole foods. So I think these are very early days. I think what we do know is that if the microbiota is degrading and fermenting these complex polysaccharides that are found in all of these, all of this plant material, they produce these metabolic end products, short chain fatty acids, and a lot of other metabolites that are actually beneficial to us, that we absorb. And these compounds help regulate our metabolism and immune function in beneficial ways. And so I think, there's likely to be a lot of benefit in eating a more plant-based diet. But the fiber aspect is really hammered home when you consider what these traditional societies, or what our ancient ancestors, the hunter-gatherers, likely ate in terms of dietary fiber, which is 150 grams per day. Somewhere between 100, 200 grams per day. We're in the United States struggling to eat 15 grams per day. So a tenfold decrease in the food that's actually feeding the microbes within your gut. And we also know that if you starve these microbes in the gut, they actually will start eating your mucus lining of your digestive tract, so that they have some food to sustain them. So not only are you, when you don't eat dietary fiber, depriving yourself of these beneficial metabolites that the microbiota produces, but you're forcing the microbes into a position where now they're consuming a really important immunological barrier in your gut.
Gosh, so much there. So let's hold off on that immunological barrier and the mucins and stuff. I want to dive into that, but there's a lot of confusion, at least for me, when I read a lot of research in the fields. High levels of, say, acetate. We know that acetate and propionate affect neurology and affect short chain or adipocyte signaling and so forth. So what does the data really show in terms of short chain fatty acids, and in terms of levels? Like, do we want a lot of butyrate, not the others? Kind of like break it down for us so people kind of understand these microbial products.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are different roles for these different short chain fatty acids for people keeping score at home. The three major ones are acetate, propionate, and butyrate that are produced by the microbiota. There are some other ones that that are generated, and they vary in different individuals based on our individual microbiota and what we're eating. But those are the three major ones, and they certainly have different impacts in terms of how they affect us physiologically. Almost all of the work in understanding how these short-chain fatty acids regulate immune function, the brain-gut axis, metabolism, have been conducted in mice. And so I think a big caveat is we don't want to overextend the mechanisms that we're learning in mice to humans too early, but all of that data is incredibly informative in terms of understanding some general themes and then pointing us towards human studies that we need to conduct to hammer out if all these things we're finding in mice hold true. But examples are, in mice, propionate has been shown to be a valuable regulator of metabolism. Propionate and butyrate have been shown to be important regulators of Treg development, of an aspect of the immune system that can actually hold the inflammatory responses in check, particularly butyrate. And so there are it appears to be some key differentiating functions, at least in mice, between these different short chain fatty acids. And it may be that eventually we'll have enough information where we'll be able to optimize exactly what we're eating, match it to the microbes that are present in our gut, and get an optimal mix of the right proportion of the different short chain fatty acids for mediating all of these. And in fact, it may get so refined that we'll be able to look at your human genome and your microbiome and say, we need to give you more parsnips and you over there more onions because we know you have this, SNP, this polymorphism in your human genome, and this is the disease that you're more predisposed to, and so this is more likely to help combat that. But I think at this early stage, it's really hard to recommend specific foods to optimize that balance because we don't know enough and because it's such an individualized issue. But what I think we can say with more confidence is that most of us are incredibly deficient in short chain fatty acids compared to what our body has adapted to over the course of evolution.
Beautifully said. And I say that because, some of the research in the context of obesity and diabetes will say that overweight individuals, their gut microbiome has an increased efficiency to harvest energy from the diet in the form of short chain fatty acids. But what I heard you say is globally, in the ideal world, we want to increase the amount of fiber that we have and increase the levels of short chain fatty acids. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, and I think a lot of, you hear about, I think a lot of people think of the microbiota as fermenting complex carbohydrates and providing us with extra calories, which in the Western world, we're not really looking for extra calories. But I think that if you look at the amount of calories that they're providing through short-chain fatty acids, it's actually pretty minimal. And it's becoming more clear that these short-chain fatty acids are playing a role far beyond just extra calories and may, in fact, help us regulate our appetite. So, okay, maybe you'll get some more short-chain fat, some extra calories from short-chain fatty acid production, but then maybe you feel full for longer, and so then you're less likely to reach for more food.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, beautifully said.
For obese individuals, that system's broken down a little bit, and it's not so much that they're harvesting more calories as it's just the whole system is making them, want more food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. So let's talk about another macronutrient, protein, that's recently been kind of controversial in the context of the gut bacteria with TMAO, and then we also have endotoxin found in animal protein. And then there was the study in, I think it was British rugby players that had a high protein diet and they had high levels of the Akkermansia. So what do we make of all this confusion with protein?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, I should preface this answer by saying that we actually know incredibly little about how dietary protein impacts the gut microbiota, how much of it even gets to the gut microbiota. And once it is there, what are the effects? And so, but I would say that there have been some really nice studies, and there is some good information that excessive protein consumption can impact the microbiota. So it's not that it's the simple model of digestion is that you eat protein, that protein gets degraded to amino acids, and all of those get absorbed into the in the small intestine. And it appears that indeed it's more complex than that. That excessive protein consumption can impact the microbiota. There's really good evidence that this one type of one class of amino acids called the aromatic amino acids can be metabolized into the gut microbiota into compounds that are then taken up into our circulation and flow around our blood. And their effects are really not well understood. They're like little drugs that are circulating in our bodies, and we have no idea what biological role they play. There appears to be potentially some deleterious consequences, but again, this is still early phases in understanding the mechanisms that link those small molecules and impact on host biology. There are other compounds in protein like carnitine, which you may have heard of, which has gotten a lot of press recently, and it's been beautifully shown by researchers that carnitine can make its way to the gut microbiota, be metabolized into a compound called trimethylamine. That compound gets taken up into our bloodstream. It gets oxidized by our liver into trimethylamine N oxide. So this gets to some of the complex co-metabolism that occurs, how our diet can impact our microbiota. Those metabolites go to our blood, and then we further metabolize those compounds. But this trimethylamine N oxide is also known as TMAO, and that metabolite has been linked to increased risk for major cardiovascular events. So problems with cardiovascular health, stroke, and heart attacks. And so I think that there's some evidence that compounds that are present in meat could play or are playing a deleterious role in our health. But again, this gets back to microbiotas being very individualized. Vegans, for instance, that don't eat a lot of meat and don't consume a lot of carnitine actually can consume meat and not have the same production of TMA by their microbiota. So there appears to be a learning curve with the microbiota. If you consume a lot of meat, your microbiota is more likely to make a lot of this harmful compound.
Interesting. So have a broccoli with your steak. Is that what we're saying here? Or
yeah, make the steak small. I mean, have broccoli with steak.
Yeah, that's right.
Nice. So, I mean, as Stanford scientists, you know much more about the gut microbiome than the 99% of the U.S. population. Are you eating meat? Like, what is your tip? I know you have a lot of recipes, which we'll talk about in your book, but are you having much animal protein, or is it mostly vegetables? Like, kind of talk about what you personally do.
We eat a plant-focused diet. So we do eat meat, but there are many days where we get to the end of the day and realize that we've eaten no meat. We've eaten mostly vegetables. We eat a lot of legumes. We try to eat something fermented every day. And for us, that usually means yogurt. So we get, a lot of animal protein through yogurt and things like kefir, fermented dairy products.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we don't exclude any. I mean, we try to maintain a highly diverse diet in the hopes that sustains a highly diverse collection of microbes in our gut. So we try to not only eat a lot of plants, but we do it in a seasonal way to give us a lot of different types of fruits and vegetables that we're consuming throughout the year.
Love it. Since you mentioned seasonal, let's talk about the seasonality. Is there changes in our gut microbiome? I know we've seen with hibernating animals, there's some shifts there. What about in humans?
Yeah, so the difficulty in humans, the humans that have been studied, is that they don't really go through big variation in diet over the course of seasons. And so if you look at time course data in humans over the course of a year or two, there aren't great patterns that emerge in the modern world with regard to ebb and flow of different microbes with availability of food, just because we can get whatever we want whenever we want. Right. But there is some data coming out with, and some of this is unpublished, that they're for human populations and other primates that eat seasonally. that there is a huge impact on the microbiota based on season. And really, this isn't surprising. If you wanted to go through the exercise of eating very seasonally over the course of a year and send your samples over the course of that year to the American Gut Project, this way of monitoring your gut microbiota, I would bet that you would be able to see clear patterns, because we know the microbiota is just so directly responsive to what you're eating. And so if you put yourself under this constraint of seasonal availability of foods, you'll almost undoubtedly see a seasonal variability in microbiota composition.
And you said very responsive to what we're eating. So tell us how responsive. If I go to McDonald's and have a bunch of junk food, are we talking about shifts after that meal? Or does it take 24, 36 hours? Like, how quick does these shifts in our phyla and gut bacteria happen?
Yeah, so the shifts that happen after you start consuming, a different meal from your previous meal is really rapid after the food reaches the colon. So it takes on the order of hours for food after you've consumed it to actually get down to the gut microbiota. But once it gets there, it has a really rapid effect. And this has been documented in studies where we see just an immediate, 24-hour response of the gut microbiota to big shifts in diet. But the other thing that's also becoming very apparent is that there's also long-term responsiveness of the microbiota to diet and dietary change. So, if you think about this example that we gave earlier with the jelly beans and diversity, you could imagine that if you were to greatly change your diet, you might not change diversity that rapidly, because diversity is responsive to what microbes are present in the system and get introduced to the system. And so if you don't have a lot of diversity, just changing your diet is unlikely to have a huge effect on diversity right away, unless you do something like a fecal transplant along with that, where you introduce just a huge number of microbes. But with the number of microbes that the average Westerner experiences on a day-to-day basis, it's likely that to experience an increase in diversity that would match increased dietary fiber consumption, that this would, and this is hypothesis, this isn't something that's been tested directly, but it's likely that this would take, months to years to gradually accumulate diversity after you had started eating, a more fiber-rich diet that would support that diversity. So I think there are both, short-term and long-term changes that you can expect.
I see. Perfect. What about if we take our broccoli and sprinkle some dirt from the garden and other bugs? Would that help? Or
yeah, so, the science on these kind of environmental microbes, say from soil or the environment, is a little unclear at this point. We know that our ancestors consumed way more soil microbes than we do today. And so from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes a lot of sense that we would have evolved to have a beneficial relationship with these soil microbes that we were encountering probably on a daily basis. But how that is working into the Western population and how soil microbes that we encounter today, play with the microbes that are in our gut right now is not really clear. So, the science is a little bit early on that, but there is evidence that consuming bacteria, say probiotic bacteria that's found in yogurt or fermented foods, that there have been some studies to show that there are health benefits for that kind of microbial exposure. So, my guess would be that soil microbes are also going to be something that we find are beneficial as well.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about fat. We know fat's kind of resurging right now. Butter was on the cover of Time magazine, but we know that fat kind of changes some of the gram-negative bacteria, how much we absorb of that. What's your take on dietary fats?
I think you don't mess with any good news about saturated fat. Just eat it and don't think about it. It's funny. This is another area that I think there's some data in, but I think it's still just right at the beginning of really understanding the relationship between fat and the gut microbiota. And there was a beautiful study out of University of Chicago showing that saturated fats can actually enrich in groups of bacteria in the gut that appear to be more problematic, that are called pathobionts, that are actually more pro-inflammatory, and so there's some evidence there that saturated fats might be bad for the microbiota. I know there's some